Hello and welcome back. This is Candace from Candoodle, and today I am back with a very highly requested video that I have finally got around to filming and editing, and this is how I make my clock spinner cards. This is a design that I've become a bit known for over on Instagram, and folks always ask me how I make it, so I have finally put together a tutorial for how to make one of these spinner cards, so I hope you enjoy. So to make this card, I'm using my Hero Arts nesting circles, but you could also use circle punches if that's what you have, my Lawn Fawn Baked with Love stamp set, but any stamp set with small images that you are okay fussy cutting or have the dies for would be great for this, and a sentiment stamp set for our circle sentiment. So I am going to start by making some of those little cupcakes, which are going to be our spinner elements, and this is how I like to do my mass producing when I am going to be making a lot of an image. I take the little dies and I center them on a piece of the 110-pound paper that I usually stamp on, and I cut them out so I have room to mount the stamps, and then I kind of fit those dies in like a little puzzle piece, and then I'm going to take my two stamps, so in this case my little cupcakes, and I'm going to center them perfectly on those little pieces, and then I'm going to put them back in if they fall out, and then I'm going to stamp them. Sometimes it takes me a try or two to get them lined up perfectly, but once they are lined up perfectly, I can just die cut as many cupcakes as I need from the paper that I use, and then I can do them really, really quickly. And so what I like to do is also take a piece of scrap paper and stamp them down once I am happy with it. That way the next time I go to mass produce these, I can keep these both in my stamp pocket, line them up in my MISTI, and then it's easier for me to set this up for the next time. And so I off screen cut a whole bunch of those little cupcakes, and as you can see I am just stamping them all down. It's super easy, it kind of fits in like a puzzle, and it's very meditative. So I did a whole bunch of those, and I knew I wouldn't use them all, but I'll use them on future cards. And I do use my little tweezers to take the cupcakes out when I have stamped them, and that's just because sometimes the ink stays a little bit wet and I don't want to smudge it with my fingers. So I found that that's a really helpful way to kind of avoid that happening. And so once our stamping is all done, we are going to move on to kind of setting up our mechanism. So I do take a bit of a Goldilocks approach to this because it's going to be different for any stamped image that you're going to use, and I use a ton of different stamped images to make this sort of card design. So I took the circle that I thought would be good, but then I realized as I lined up my cupcakes it would be hanging over, so I grabbed a smaller one, but then it looked a bit crowded, so I grabbed another smaller one, and then I was finally happy with the spacing of the cupcakes and thought this would be the final design that I settled on. And so that outer circle is 2 inches in diameter, and then I'm taking a 1.5 inch in diameter circle because we're going to essentially make a ring. And so I'm just kind of taping those down to try and keep them as equidistant apart as possible to keep that ring sort of looking as concentric as I can. And so I'm actually going to cut that twice. So you can use 2 rings or 1 ring, which I'll show you later. And these are basically just to give some lift, but it'll make sense later on. So now while we're here, we're going to make a 3rd ring, and this is the one that the actual die cut pieces, so in my case the cupcakes, are actually going to sit on. And so I want it to be a little bit bigger so it covers the rings underneath. So I'm using that same circle on the inside, the 1.5 inch diameter one, and the outer circle this time I have moved up to the 2.25 inch size. So it's just going to be a little bit bigger than the rings that we made previously. And so this is the ring that our die cut images are going to be glued to, which we're going to do next. So you'll end up this process with 3 rings. You don't necessarily need the underneath 2, you can get away with 1, but I'll show you that later. So before we assemble our mechanism, we do have to do some coloring. I'm only going to show you this once for each of the cupcake types because I colored them all the same. So I basically used just kind of some browns towards the bottom, and I kept the shading towards the left side for each of them. I did use gray for the tops, which I know seems a little bit weird, but I wanted it to look like a white cupcake but still have some shading and dimension. And then I am coming in with some different rainbow colors, all of them will be listed on the screen, to just add some sprinkles to the cupcakes. I thought this gave it a really fun sort of rainbow look, and it could go with any sort of background color. So I just thought that I would do this for something different, and you could color these however you wanted or use any sort of stamped images to do this. I just felt like doing a birthday card with cupcakes today. So once our coloring is done, I am going to ink blend a background with some Distress Oxide inks. I came in with Mustard Seed towards the center, and then towards the top I'm going to do Spiced Marmalade and Abandoned Coral, and then on the bottom I am going to do Twisted Citron and Peacock Feathers. I just wanted kind of a nice rainbow fun background for our cupcakes to sit on, but you could use any sort of background. You could use pattern paper, colored cardstock, anything. And of course, I have to do my little distress inking, so I'm coming in with my spray bottle and picking that up with my paper towel. And so once that background has dried, I am going to come in with my ATG and stick it down to the card base, and then we are going to move on to assembling our mechanism. So once I've got all of my pieces together and laid out, we are going to assemble the mechanism. So just to show you where we're headed, we're going to have our 2 rings underneath, the next ring on top, and then we are going to have all of our little cupcakes sitting on top of that ring and glued down to it. So instead of putting all the cupcakes on that ring and gluing them down on top of our lovely background we've created, it's best to do it on a piece of scrap paper. That way if any of the glue oozes out, it's not going to get on our background. So I don't line these up super perfectly. I just try and line one up at the top and the bottom and then glue everything else around as evenly as I can. And you're only gluing the bottom part of the cupcakes or your stamped images to the ring, and the top just kind of hangs off. And so once I have that done, I am going to center it as best I can on my card base. You could do it towards the center. I generally like to do it towards the top center. And then once I have an idea of where that is going to go, I am going to get a pencil just so I can kind of quickly mark where it's going to go, so I know where I'm going to put my foam tape. And so I do that to put a pencil line. You don't need to do this, but I thought it would be easier for you to see on camera as well. And then I'm going to get some foam tape. I'm just making sure that that's going to be enough foam tape to go around the circumference of the circle. And then I'm taking one of my rings and I'm going to go around the inside of the circle. The inside, and you want it to have a little bit of wiggle room so it can spin, obviously. But you don't want it to have enough wiggle room that it can jiggle around, or else your spinner is going to jiggle on your front of your card base. And I do like to take the release paper off of both sides so it's a little bit more malleable to work with. And then I'm just putting my decorative piece on top and making sure that I can spin and I don't need to change anything. So as I said, you can do 2 rings underneath and then have your decorative one on top, which is the spinner. But if you're going to do that, I would suggest doing 2 layers of foam tape. Versus if you only want 1 ring underneath, it's going to have a little bit less lift, but you don't need the 2 layers of foam tape. So what's going to keep our spinner on the card is our sentiment circle. So I generally like to use one that has a bit of a decorative edge, but this one in particular might not be suitable because it has some scallops that were getting in the way of those die cuts and kind of catching on them. So I decided to use a different circle, but if you wanted to use one that had a decorative edge like that, I would suggest doing 2 layers of foam tape so there's some extra space so your die cut images won't get stuck. What I also like to do is put a small piece of foam tape on the back of each of my die cuts. That way it gives it some extra lift so the recipient can more easily stick their finger in to spin the circle. What I will say is I leave the release paper on mine and have never had an issue. If you do take it off, you're going to want to use an anti-static powder tool to make sure that foam tape doesn't have any stick, or your spinner is going to stick down to your card and defeat the purpose. So I usually stick my sentiment circle directly down to the foam tape, but I did want to create a bit of extra lift, but not quite enough that there was 2 layers of foam tape. So I just took 2 cardstock circles that were actually the result of when we did our initial die cutting of the rings and put those on top of the foam tape. And so my spinner could fall off, but then I was going to put the sentiment circle on top of that. And as you can see, there's a lot more space now for it to spin. And so the sentiment circle is actually the inner circle from the Lawn Fawn Magic Iris. And I wanted to show you because there's these 2 stamp sets I've been using with these circles that I absolutely love and use on almost every card now. And so one of them is the Lawn Fawn Magic Messages, which are made to go in this circle, and the other that fits really nicely is the Avery Elle Everyday Circle Tags. And so that's the one that I'm going to be using today, and I'm just taking the Happy Birthday, which fits perfectly within this circle, and I am going to stamp that down on the sentiment circle that we're going to use, but you could use any sort of sentiment on this. These are just ones that I use quite often when I'm doing this card design and on a lot of different card designs where I'm using a sentiment circle, so I thought I would show them. So once that happy birthday is stamped down, I am going to double check that everything spins one more time, and then I am just going to use some Gina adhesive to glue down our sentiment circle, and then that is the final card. As simple as that. I absolutely love this card design, and I've used it for so many different types of cards across the years, everything from Christmas cards to birthday cards, Easter. I'll insert a few examples here. I think it is so fun, and it's such a lovely interactive element to add to cards, and it's not that complicated to put together, and I hope I've done a good job of showing you that today. You can use the supplies that you have. You really only need circle dies in order to make this card, and you can use any sort of die cut images to your heart's content. So I hope that you enjoyed today's tutorial, and if you do make a card inspired by this, I'd love to see it. As always, you can always find me over on Instagram at Candoodle Creations, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!